The fluorescent lights of courtroom 4B cast harsh shadows across the polished wooden benches as Linda Morrison sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap like a schoolchild awaiting punishment. To everyone watching, she looked exactly like what her husband's attorney wanted them to see. A meek, dependent housewife who had spent 15 years living off her successful husband's hard work. The judge peered over his reading glasses as Marcus Morrison's attorney, a sharp-suited woman named Catherine Voss, paced confidently before the bench. Before we dive deeper into this story of justice served cold, I'm curious where you're watching from today. Are you following along from your home office, your living room, or maybe somewhere else entirely? Comment below and let me know what state or country you're tuning in from. There's something about courthouse dramas that seem to hit differently, depending on where you are in the world. Catherine's voice rang out with practiced authority as she painted Linda as nothing more than financial deadweight. She has contributed absolutely nothing to this marriage, Your Honor, the attorney declared, her tone dripping with barely concealed disdain. While my client worked tirelessly through law school, building a practice that now serves hundreds of clients, the defendant chose to remain unemployed, living entirely off his efforts and sacrifices. Marcus Morrison sat tall in his chair, his expensive suit tailored perfectly to his lean frame, his silver hair swept back in a way that screamed success and confidence. At 42, he looked every inch the accomplished attorney, his Rolex catching the light as he adjusted his tie. His eyes never left Linda's face as his attorney spoke, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth like a cat watching a cornered mouse. The woman sitting 3 rows behind Marcus leaned forward slightly, her glossy red lips curving into a satisfied smirk. Rebecca Chun had been dating Marcus for 8 months now, ever since he'd separated from what he called his deadweight wife. She'd heard all the stories about Linda's supposed laziness, her complete inability to contribute anything meaningful to their household. Rebecca's designer handbag sat beside her, containing the vacation brochures Marcus had shown her last week. Once this divorce was finalized, they'd be taking that European cruise he'd promised, funded by his hard-earned assets. Linda's attorney, a quiet man named David Park, sat beside his client with the calm demeanor of someone holding a royal flush in a poker game. His cheap suit and worn briefcase made him look completely outmatched against the polished legal machine representing Marcus, but his eyes held something that might have been anticipation, though he kept his expression carefully neutral. Catherine Voss continued her opening statement with theatrical flair. Your Honor, the evidence will show that Linda Morrison has not held a single job during their 15-year marriage. She has no business ownership, no investment accounts in her name, no income of any kind. She has been, quite literally, a complete financial dependent who now seeks to claim half of everything my client has worked so hard to build. Marcus nodded approvingly at each point, his confidence growing with every word. He remembered those early days when Linda would suggest he was being too harsh about money, when she tried to insert herself into conversations about his career plans. He'd shut down those attempts quickly enough, making it clear who wore the pants in their relationship. Now, sitting in this courtroom, he felt vindicated. Everyone could see the truth. He was the successful one, the provider, the achiever. Linda was just the woman who'd been lucky enough to be married to him. The judge, an elderly man named Harrison Blake, had heard dozens of similar cases over his 20-year career. Typically, these divorces involved successful men and dependent wives who'd sacrificed their careers for family life. He found himself automatically sympathizing with Marcus's position, though something about Linda's complete calm struck him as unusual. Most women in her position showed more emotion, more desperation when facing the potential loss of their lifestyle. As Catherine's opening statement reached its crescendo, she gestured dismissively toward Linda. The defendant now claims she deserves half of my client's law practice, half of their investments, half of everything he's earned through his own blood, sweat, and tears. But, Your Honor, you cannot give away what was never contributed to in the first place. This is a clear case of someone trying to profit from another person's hard work, and justice demands that we recognize the difference between the earner and the dependent. Linda's memories drifted back 15 years to their tiny apartment near the law school, where she'd worked until midnight most nights, her fingers cramped from typing term papers for other students while Marcus studied. She remembered the pride in his voice when he'd called her his secret weapon, joking that her 3 jobs were keeping them afloat while he focused on becoming a lawyer. She remembered staying up with him before his bar exam, quizzing him on constitutional law while she balanced their checkbook, making sure they had enough money for his exam fees and their rent. Marcus's testimony began with practiced confidence. He spoke about the long hours building his practice, the sacrifices he'd made to provide Linda with a comfortable lifestyle, the way he'd carried the entire financial burden of their marriage while she enjoyed the fruits of his labor. His voice carried the weight of absolute conviction as he described Linda's complete dependence on his income, her inability to contribute anything meaningful to their financial situation. Rebecca felt a warm surge of satisfaction listening to Marcus speak. This was exactly why she'd been attracted to him: his strength, his success, his ability to provide for a woman properly. Unlike Linda, Rebecca had her own career in marketing, but she looked forward to the day when Marcus would be successful enough that she could choose to step back from work if she wanted to. She'd never be the kind of deadweight wife that Linda had apparently been. David Park took careful notes throughout Marcus's testimony, occasionally asking for clarification on dates and amounts. His questions seemed almost casual, as if he were simply trying to understand the timeline rather than challenging anything Marcus said. When Marcus claimed he'd supported Linda entirely throughout law school, David simply nodded and asked what year that was. When Marcus described Linda as unemployed throughout their marriage, David asked if that included the early years as well. Each question was gentle, almost apologetic, as if David were embarrassed to be taking up the court's time with such obvious facts. Linda watched her husband lie with the same easy confidence he'd once used to sweet-talk her into believing she wasn't smart enough to handle their finances. She remembered how gradually he'd convinced her to let him manage everything, how he'd made her feel stupid for asking questions about their accounts. She remembered the way he'd dismissed her suggestions about investments, her concerns about their spending, her desire to start her own small business. Over the years, she'd learned to stay quiet about money, to let him make all the decisions, to accept his version of reality where she contributed nothing and he provided everything. The morning sun shifted through the tall courthouse windows, casting different shadows across the room as Marcus's testimony continued. His confidence seemed to grow with each question, each opportunity to describe Linda's dependence on his success. He spoke about supporting her completely through law school, funding her lifestyle for 15 years, giving her everything while getting nothing in return except the burden of her financial needs. Judge Blake found himself impressed by Marcus's composure and clarity. The man presented a compelling picture of a hard-working professional who'd been generous with a woman who'd never learned to stand on her own feet. It seemed like a straightforward case, the kind where the law clearly supported the working spouse against the dependent one. As Marcus's testimony concluded, Catherine Voss smiled with satisfaction. The foundation was laid perfectly. Marcus had established himself as the sole breadwinner, the only contributor to their marital assets, the only one deserving of protection in this divorce. Linda sat across the courtroom like exactly what she appeared to be, a woman who'd never learned to take care of herself and now faced the harsh reality of life without someone else's money to support her. But David Park's expression hadn't changed throughout the entire morning. He sat with the same calm patience, occasionally glancing at the thick folder of documents beside his briefcase. When the judge asked if he had any questions for Marcus during this initial phase, David simply shook his head with a small smile and said he'd prefer to wait for the appropriate time to present his client's position. Rebecca checked her phone and saw a text from her friend asking how the divorce was going. She typed back quickly, "Exactly like we expected. His wife has nothing. Should be over soon." She slipped her phone back into her designer purse and settled back to watch what she assumed would be the final destruction of Linda Morrison's pathetic attempt to claim money she'd never earned. Catherine Voss returned to her feet with theatrical precision, her heels clicking against the marble floor as she approached the evidence table. "Your Honor, I'd like to present Exhibits A through M, which demonstrate the complete financial dependence of the defendant throughout this marriage." She lifted a neat stack of papers with practiced flair, each document carefully selected to support Marcus's narrative of being the sole provider. The first exhibit showed Linda's complete absence from any formal employment records over the past 15 years. No W-2 forms, no business licenses, no corporate partnerships, nothing that would indicate she'd contributed a single dollar to their household income. Catherine held the papers high enough for the judge to see clearly. As you can observe, Your Honor, there is literally no evidence that Linda Morrison has earned any income whatsoever during the entire duration of this marriage. Marcus leaned back in his chair with growing satisfaction. This was exactly why he'd chosen Catherine Voss despite her higher fees. She understood how to present the facts in a way that left no room for doubt. He glanced toward Linda, who sat motionless as always, her cheap department store dress making her look even more like the dependent housewife everyone believed her to be. He remembered buying her that dress last Christmas, rolling his eyes at her pathetic gratitude for something that cost him less than lunch at his favorite restaurant. Judge Blake examined each document as Catherine presented them. The pattern seemed clear and consistent. Marcus Morrison had carried the entire financial burden of their marriage, while his wife contributed nothing measurable to their economic success. The judge had seen this scenario countless times, though he noticed that Linda's attorney continued taking notes with unusual intensity for such a straightforward case. The second wave of exhibits focused on what Catherine termed Linda's frivolous spending habits. She presented credit card statements showing purchases at department stores, grocery bills, utility payments, all charged to accounts bearing only Marcus's name. My client has funded every aspect of the defendant's lifestyle, Catherine announced, her voice carrying just the right note of righteous indignation. From her morning coffee to her evening entertainment, every dollar has come from his earnings, while she contributed absolutely nothing in return. Rebecca felt her phone buzz and saw another message from her friend asking for updates. She typed back proudly, watching his lawyer destroy the ex-wife right now. She literally never worked a day in her life. Pathetic, really. She hit send and looked up to see Catherine presenting what appeared to be the final nail in Linda's financial coffin. Marcus took the stand again for his detailed testimony about Linda's complete inability to manage money or contribute to their household. He spoke with the confident authority of a man who'd never been seriously challenged, describing how he'd been forced to take control of all financial decisions because Linda simply lacked the intelligence and discipline to handle such responsibilities. She couldn't balance a checkbook if her life depended on it, Marcus testified, shaking his head with what appeared to be long-suffering patience. I tried to teach her about investments, about budgeting, about basic financial planning, but she just couldn't grasp the concepts. It became clear early in our marriage that I'd have to handle everything myself if we were going to have any financial security at all. The memories hit Linda like physical blows as she listened to Marcus rewrite their history. She remembered the night she'd shown him her carefully researched investment suggestions, how he'd laughed and told her to stick to cooking and cleaning. She remembered presenting him with a detailed budget she'd created to help them save for a house down payment, how he'd dismissed it as naive housewife math and torn it up in front of her. She remembered the business plan she'd developed for a small consulting firm, how he'd told her it was embarrassing and forbade her from mentioning such ridiculous ideas again. Marcus's voice grew stronger as he warmed to his subject. I gave her everything she needed to live comfortably, he continued, his tone suggesting generous patience with an ungrateful dependent. I never asked her to work because, frankly, I wasn't sure she was capable of holding down a real job. She seemed content to let me handle all the adult responsibilities while she focused on household tasks and personal interests. David Park's pen moved steadily across his notepad, but his expression remained carefully neutral. Occasionally, he would glance up at Marcus with what might have been mild interest, as if he were simply trying to understand the timeline of events rather than preparing to challenge anything being said. When Marcus described Linda as completely unemployable, David made a small notation. When Marcus claimed he'd supported her entirely through law school, David wrote down the specific years mentioned. Catherine resumed her questioning with surgical precision. She had Marcus detail every major financial decision of their marriage, from the purchase of their home to their investment portfolio, from his law practice expansion to their retirement planning. In each case, Marcus testified that he'd made every decision alone because Linda lacked the knowledge and capability to contribute meaningfully to such important matters. The law practice was entirely my creation, Marcus stated with obvious pride. I researched the market, developed the business plan, secured the initial capital, built the client base, and managed every aspect of growth. Linda had absolutely no involvement in any business decisions because she simply didn't understand that world. Her role was to support me at home so I could focus on building our financial future. Rebecca shifted in her seat, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and slight unease. She'd always been proud of her own career achievements, her ability to contribute equally to any relationship. Listening to Marcus describe Linda's complete dependence made Rebecca feel superior by comparison, but it also planted a tiny seed of doubt about what Marcus expected from the women in his life. She pushed the thought away, telling herself that Linda's situation was obviously different because Linda had never tried to be anything more than a housewife. Judge Blake found himself increasingly convinced by the clear pattern of dependence Marcus described. The testimony painted a picture of a generous husband who'd carried an enormous financial burden while his wife enjoyed the benefits without contributing anything meaningful in return. It seemed like exactly the kind of case where the law should protect the earning spouse from having their assets unfairly divided. Marcus continued his testimony with growing confidence, describing how he'd tried repeatedly to encourage Linda to develop some kind of career or business interest, only to be met with what he characterized as lazy indifference. She always had excuses, he explained, his voice carrying overtones of long-suffering disappointment. Too tired, too complicated, too risky. Eventually, I stopped suggesting it because it was clear she preferred to live off my income rather than make any effort to earn her own. The afternoon light streaming through the courthouse windows had shifted significantly by the time Marcus finished describing Linda's various failures to contribute financially to their marriage. He spoke about paying for her car, her clothes, her medical expenses, her personal spending money, every detail designed to reinforce the image of complete dependence that Catherine had established in her opening statement. David Park finally looked up from his notepad when Judge Blake asked if he had any questions for Marcus during this phase of testimony. The quiet attorney adjusted his glasses and stood slowly, carrying a single sheet of paper to the podium. His first question seemed almost apologetically simple. "Mr. Morrison, you mentioned that you supported your wife entirely through law school. Could you help me understand the exact time frame we're discussing?" David's voice was gentle, almost deferential, as if he were embarrassed to be taking up the court's time with such obvious details. Marcus answered confidently that he'd attended State University Law School from 2009 to 2012, during which time Linda had contributed nothing to their household income and had instead relied entirely on his efforts to keep them financially afloat. David nodded thoughtfully and made another notation on his paper. "And during that law school period, you mentioned that you funded all living expenses, tuition, and other costs associated with your education. Is that correct?" David's second question carried the same gentle, almost curious tone, as if he were simply trying to understand the basic facts rather than challenging anything Marcus had said. Marcus confirmed this emphatically, explaining that he'd worked part-time throughout law school while also maintaining his grades and taking on the additional responsibility of supporting a wife who couldn't or wouldn't support herself. He painted a picture of heroic sacrifice, a young man carrying double the normal burden because his wife lacked the initiative to lighten his load. David asked about the specific amounts involved in law school expenses, the sources of income Marcus had used to fund their lifestyle during those years, and whether Marcus had any documentation of the financial arrangements from that period. Each question seemed motivated by simple curiosity rather than skeptical investigation, and Marcus answered each one with increasing confidence. "Thank you, Mr. Morrison," David said politely, returning to his seat with the same calm demeanor he'd maintained throughout the morning. "I believe those details will be very helpful as we proceed." He placed the single sheet of paper back in his folder and sat quietly, giving no indication of what he might be planning for his own presentation of evidence. Catherine concluded her case presentation with a sweeping summary of Linda's complete financial dependence, her utter failure to contribute anything meaningful to the marriage, and her current attempt to claim assets she'd never helped to create. "The evidence is overwhelming, Your Honor. My client has been the sole financial provider for 15 years, supporting a wife who chose dependence over contribution, comfort over capability. Justice demands that we protect his earned assets from this unwarranted claim. As the afternoon session ended, Marcus felt the deep satisfaction of a battle well fought. Every piece of evidence had supported his position. Every testimony had reinforced Linda's image as a financial dependent who deserved nothing more than basic support. He could already picture his new life with Rebecca, free from the burden of supporting someone who'd never appreciated his generosity or made any effort to earn her own way in the world. Rebecca gathered her purse and stood to leave, feeling completely vindicated in her assessment of the situation. Marcus had been right about everything, and soon he'd be free to build a real partnership with someone who actually brought value to a relationship. She couldn't imagine being as pathetic as Linda, sitting there silent and defeated, facing the loss of a lifestyle she'd never worked to earn. But David Park remained seated as the courtroom began to empty, his thick folder of documents still unopened beside his worn briefcase. He watched Marcus and Catherine shake hands with obvious satisfaction, observed Rebecca's confident smile as she linked her arm through Marcus's, and noted the way Judge Blake organized his papers with the efficient movements of someone who expected the next day's proceedings to be fairly straightforward. Linda stood slowly and smoothed down her simple dress, her movements careful and controlled. She followed David out of the courtroom without speaking, but her calm hadn't wavered throughout the entire day of testimony designed to destroy her credibility and reduce her to nothing more than a greedy dependent. Tomorrow would bring a very different kind of revelation, and David Park's folder contained enough documentation to turn Marcus Morrison's confident lies into a devastating avalanche of truth that would bury his reputation, his finances, and his future with the same systematic precision he'd used to erase Linda's contributions from their shared history. The morning sun cast long shadows across courtroom 4B as David Park stood to begin his presentation of evidence. His worn briefcase sat open on the defense table, revealing stacks of meticulously organized documents that seemed to dwarf the modest collection Catherine Voss had presented the previous day. Judge Blake settled back in his chair, expecting this portion of the proceedings to be brief and relatively routine. After all, how much evidence could possibly exist to contradict Marcus Morrison's clear testimony about his wife's complete financial dependence? David's first move surprised everyone in the courtroom. Instead of beginning with character witnesses or emotional appeals, he walked directly to a wheeled cart that had been positioned near his table overnight. The cart held what appeared to be several large boxes of documents, each labeled with dates spanning from 2009 to the present. Marcus felt the first flutter of unease as he watched David methodically arrange bankers' boxes that seemed to contain far more documentation than he'd expected Linda's attorney to possess. "Your Honor," David began in his quiet, measured voice, "I'd like to begin with some basic financial records that will help clarify the actual monetary contributions made during this marriage. With the court's permission, I'll start with the period from September 2009 to May 2012, which corresponds to Mr. Morrison's law school attendance." Marcus shifted slightly in his chair as David opened the first banker's box and withdrew a thick folder marked Bank Records 2009-2012. The attorney's movements were deliberate and unhurried, like a chess master who had planned his strategy many moves in advance. Catherine Voss frowned slightly, clearly wondering why Linda's attorney had access to banking records that should have been heavily weighted in Marcus's favor. The first document David presented to the court was a Chase Bank statement from September 2009, showing the checking account Marcus had used throughout law school. As David placed the statement on the overhead projector, every person in the courtroom could clearly see the account holder's name, Marcus A. Morrison. But what caught Judge Blake's attention immediately were the regular deposits that appeared throughout the month, each one stamped with a designation that read Deposit by L. Morrison. "Mr. Morrison," David said, turning to face Marcus directly, "can you help the court understand these deposits that appear in your account during your first month of law school?" According to this September 2009 statement, there were 7 separate deposits made by L. Morrison, totaling $4,600. "Since you testified yesterday that you supported your wife entirely during law school, I'm hoping you can explain the source of these funds." Marcus felt his throat tighten as he stared at the projected bank statement. He'd completely forgotten about those early deposits, hadn't thought about the specific mechanics of how their money had flowed during those first months of law school. His mind raced as he tried to formulate an explanation that would maintain his narrative while accounting for evidence he hadn't expected to face. "Those were gifts from Linda's family," Marcus said, his voice carrying slightly less confidence than it had the previous day. "Her parents helped us out occasionally during the difficult early period of law school. It wasn't regular income on Linda's part, just occasional family assistance that happened to be deposited under her name." David nodded thoughtfully and reached for another document from his folder. "That's very helpful context, Mr. Morrison. So these deposits from L. Morrison represent gifts from Linda's parents. Is that correct?" He placed a second bank statement on the projector, this one from October 2009, showing 8 more deposits from L. Morrison totaling $5,200. "And I assume these October deposits would also be family gifts." Marcus confirmed this explanation, though his voice had developed a slight edge that hadn't been present in his confident testimony the previous day. Rebecca leaned forward in her seat, for the first time feeling a flutter of concern about the direction these questions were taking. The deposits were larger and more frequent than she'd expected, and Marcus seemed less certain in his responses than he'd been when describing Linda's supposed dependence. David continued methodically through the bank statements, month by month, showing a consistent pattern of substantial deposits from L. Morrison that occurred with clockwork regularity throughout Marcus's entire law school period. By the time he reached the statements from spring 2010, the deposits had grown to nearly $6,000 per month, and Judge Blake was beginning to look puzzled by the sheer volume of these alleged family gifts. The breakthrough moment came when David placed a particularly detailed bank statement from April 2010 on the projector and asked Marcus to examine the deposit information more carefully. "This statement shows an interesting detail, Mr. Morrison. Each deposit from L. Morrison includes a source notation that wasn't visible on the earlier statements. Can you read for the court what the source notation says for the April 15th deposit of $2,000? Marcus squinted at the statement, his face growing pale as he read the fine print that appeared below each deposit entry. The notation read: source account, Linda Morrison personal checking, account number 4789, First National Bank. His carefully constructed explanation about family gifts crumbled instantly, as the evidence showed the money coming directly from Linda's personal banking account rather than from any external family source. Catherine Voss stood immediately to object, claiming that the source of deposits wasn't relevant to the question of Linda's contributions to the marriage, but Judge Blake overruled her objection with obvious interest. "The court finds this information highly relevant, given yesterday's testimony about the defendant's complete lack of financial contribution during the law school period." David opened a second folder and began presenting documentation that revealed the true source of Linda's law school period income. The first document was a W-2 form from Academic Support Services, showing that Linda Morrison had earned $18,000 in 2009 providing tutoring services to undergraduate students. The second document was a 1099 from Henderson Bookkeeping Solutions, indicating that Linda had earned $22,000 that same year as an independent contractor handling small business financial records. The third document hit the courtroom like a bombshell. It was an employment verification letter from Gino's Italian restaurant, confirming that Linda Morrison had worked as a server during evening hours throughout 2009 and 2010, earning an average of $1,500 per month in wages and tips. The letter was signed by the restaurant manager and notarized, making it impossible to dismiss as fabricated evidence. Marcus stared at the projected documents in growing horror as the full scope of Linda's work during law school became undeniably clear. She had been working 3 separate jobs simultaneously, earning more money than he'd made from his part-time work at the university library, and contributing the vast majority of their living expenses while he focused on his studies. Rebecca's confident smirk had completely disappeared as she watched the evidence accumulate against Marcus's testimony. The man she'd been dating for 8 months, the successful attorney she believed had built everything through his own hard work, had apparently been lying about his wife's contributions from the very beginning of their relationship. David continued his methodical presentation, showing bank records that traced Linda's income from all 3 jobs being deposited into her personal account, and then transferred to Marcus's account to cover their rent, food, utilities, and his law school expenses. The pattern was consistent month after month for the entire 3-year period, revealing a level of financial support that made Marcus's testimony about being the sole provider appear laughably false. But the most devastating revelation came when David presented Marcus's law school tuition payment records. Instead of showing payments from Marcus's part-time job or student loans as expected, the records showed that every semester's tuition had been paid directly from Linda Morrison's personal checking account. She had literally funded his entire legal education while working 3 jobs and managing their household expenses. "Mr. Morrison," David said, his quiet voice cutting through the stunned silence of the courtroom, "you testified yesterday that you supported your wife entirely through law school and that she contributed nothing to your household income. However, these records indicate that during your 3 years of law school, Linda Morrison earned approximately $135,000 from employment and contributed nearly 90% of that income to your living expenses and education costs. Can you help the court reconcile these facts with your previous testimony?" Marcus felt the walls closing in around him as he struggled to formulate a response that might salvage some credibility from the wreckage of his lies. His face had turned an alarming shade of red, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool temperature in the courtroom. The confident attorney who had smugly testified about his wife's dependents looked increasingly desperate as the documentary evidence systematically destroyed every claim he'd made. "She was paying me back," Marcus said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "for supporting her before law school, for the early years of our relationship when I carried the financial burden. These payments were just Linda returning money she owed me from earlier periods when I'd been the provider." David reached into his third folder and withdrew what appeared to be several years' worth of additional bank records. "That's an interesting theory, Mr. Morrison. Let's examine the financial records from before law school and see if they support your claim about providing early support to Linda that she was later repaying." The bank statements from 2007 and 2008 told an even more devastating story. They showed that Linda had been the primary income earner throughout their early relationship as well, working full-time as a bookkeeper while Marcus completed his undergraduate degree. The records revealed that Linda had not only supported both of them during Marcus's senior year of college, but had also saved nearly $30,000 toward their future law school expenses. Judge Blake removed his reading glasses and rubbed his eyes as the scope of the deception became clear. In 30 years on the bench, he had rarely seen such a systematic misrepresentation of facts in a divorce proceeding. The evidence being presented painted a picture completely opposite to the confident testimony Marcus had provided, and the documentation appeared to be unassailable. Catherine Voss attempted damage control by questioning the relevance of historical financial records to current asset division, but her objections sounded increasingly weak as David continued to present evidence that contradicted every major claim in her opening statement. The narrative of Marcus as the sole provider and Linda as the dependent spouse had been obliterated by an overwhelming volume of documentary proof. Rebecca felt sick to her stomach as she watched Marcus's credibility evaporate under the weight of evidence he clearly hadn't expected to face. She thought about all the conversations they'd had about Linda's supposed laziness, all the times Marcus had portrayed himself as the victim of an ungrateful wife who'd never worked a day in her life. Every story he'd told her was apparently a complete fabrication. David's presentation was methodical and devastating, each document building upon the previous one to create an irrefutable pattern of Linda's financial contributions and Marcus's systematic lies about her role in their economic success. The quiet attorney who had seemed so outmatched the previous day was revealing himself to be a master strategist who had spent months preparing for this moment. As the morning session drew to a close, Marcus sat slumped in his chair like a man watching his entire life collapse in real time. The confident attorney who had walked into court expecting easy victory was facing the destruction of not only his divorce case, but potentially his professional reputation, as officers of the court were not expected to commit perjury during their own legal proceedings. Linda remained as calm and composed as she had throughout Marcus's lies the previous day. She watched her husband face the consequences of his deception with the same steady demeanor she'd maintained through years of gaslighting about her contributions to their marriage. The truth was finally being told, and she felt neither vindictive satisfaction nor regret, only a quiet sense that justice was beginning to emerge from beneath the layers of manipulation and financial abuse she'd endured. The judge called for a lunch recess with instructions for both attorneys to prepare for afternoon testimony, but everyone in the courtroom understood that the fundamental dynamic of the case had shifted permanently. Marcus Morrison's confident narrative about his dependent wife had been revealed as a house of cards built on systematic lies, and the evidence suggested that David Park was just getting started with his devastating presentation of the truth. When court reconvened after lunch, David Park had arranged his evidence table with the precision of a surgeon preparing for a complex operation. The banker's boxes that had seemed impressive that morning now appeared to be merely the opening act for a much larger production. Additional carts had been wheeled in during the break, each loaded with meticulously organized folders that spanned the entire 15 years of the Morrison marriage. Marcus returned to his seat looking like a man who'd spent his lunch break staring into an abyss, while Rebecca had chosen to sit several rows farther back, as if physical distance might somehow protect her from the continuing demolition of everything Marcus had told her. David's afternoon presentation began with what he termed a comprehensive financial forensic analysis of the Morrison marriage, conducted by a certified public accountant who specialized in divorce asset investigation. The accountant, a Sharpied woman named Patricia Wells, took the stand with the confidence of someone who had spent 3 months reconstructing 15 years of financial records that someone had apparently tried very hard to obscure. Ms. Wells presented her findings with the methodical precision that had made her one of the most sought-after forensic accountants in the state. Her analysis covered every major financial transaction during the Morrison marriage, from daily household expenses to major investment decisions, from business startup costs to retirement planning contributions. What she had discovered was a financial relationship that bore absolutely no resemblance to the narrative Marcus had presented in his confident testimony. According to Ms. Wells's analysis, Linda Morrison had contributed an average of 67% of the household income throughout their marriage, with some years reaching as high as 75% when her investment returns were included. Far from being the dependent housewife Marcus had described, Linda had been the primary breadwinner for their entire relationship, consistently out-earning her husband even during the years when his law practice was supposedly thriving. The most damaging revelation came when Ms. Wells presented her analysis of Marcus's bar exam and early career expenses. Every cost associated with his transition from law school to practicing attorney had been funded entirely by Linda's income and savings. The bar exam fees, the bar review course, his first year of office rent, his initial malpractice insurance, even the suits he'd worn to court during his early career, all of it had been paid for with money that Linda had earned from her continued work in financial consulting and bookkeeping. Marcus attempted to interrupt the testimony with claims that these had been loans that he'd repaid with interest, but David calmly presented loan documentation that told a very different story. The papers showed that Linda had indeed structured some early payments as loans, but Marcus had defaulted on every single repayment agreement, and Linda had eventually forgiven the debts rather than pursue collection against her own husband. Ms. Wells continued her presentation with an analysis of the couple's investment portfolio, which revealed that Linda had been making sophisticated financial decisions that had grown their wealth substantially over the years. While Marcus had focused on his law practice, Linda had quietly built a diversified investment strategy that had outperformed the market consistently, turning her steady contributions into substantial long-term wealth that had funded their comfortable lifestyle. The investments told a story of careful financial planning and considerable expertise that directly contradicted Marcus's testimony about Linda's supposed inability to understand money or make financial decisions. Her portfolio included strategic real estate investments, carefully timed stock purchases, and tax-advantaged retirement contributions that demonstrated a level of financial sophistication that made Marcus's characterization of her as financially incompetent appear ludicrously false. Rebecca felt a growing sense of nausea as she listened to the forensic accountant describe Linda's impressive financial achievements. Every conversation she'd had with Marcus about his wife's supposed stupidity and laziness was being revealed as not just false, but as the exact opposite of reality. The woman Marcus had portrayed as a burden had actually been supporting and funding his entire lifestyle for 15 years. David's next presentation focused specifically on Marcus's law practice, which Ms. Wells had analyzed with particular attention to its initial capitalization and ongoing operational funding. The records showed that Marcus had never invested a single dollar of his own money into his law practice. The initial office setup, the legal research databases, the client development expenses, the administrative staff salaries for the first 3 years, all of it had been funded by systematic transfers from Linda's personal accounts. Even more devastating was the revelation that Linda had used a substantial inheritance from her grandmother to provide the seed money that had allowed Marcus to leave his initial job at a large firm and start his own practice. The inheritance, worth nearly $200,000, had been deposited directly into the business account for Morrison Legal Services, giving Marcus the financial foundation he needed to build what he'd claimed was his independent professional success. Ms. Wells presented bank records showing that Linda's inheritance money had funded not just the startup costs, but the first year of operating expenses that had allowed Marcus to establish his client base without the pressure of immediate profitability. Without Linda's financial support during that crucial period, Marcus would never have been able to leave his salaried position and create the successful practice he now claimed as his sole accomplishment. Marcus's attempts to explain away this evidence became increasingly desperate as each new document contradicted his previous explanations. He claimed the inheritance had been a joint gift, but the probate records clearly showed it had been left specifically to Linda. He claimed the business funding had been structured as a spousal investment, but the corporate records showed no ownership stake for Linda despite her complete financial backing of the venture. The revelation that broke the last of Marcus's credibility came when Ms. Wells presented what she called the smoking gun of financial deception. Hidden in the complex corporate structure that Marcus had created for his law practice was a series of profit-sharing agreements that had systematically diverted Linda's investment returns into accounts that appeared to belong solely to Marcus, but were actually funded entirely by her financial contributions. Judge Blake's expression grew increasingly stern as he listened to Ms. Wells describe a financial arrangement that appeared designed specifically to hide Linda's contributions while magnifying Marcus's apparent success. The forensic accountant had uncovered a systematic pattern of financial manipulation that went far beyond simple marital asset commingling into territory that bordered on financial fraud. The most shocking revelation came when David presented evidence that Linda had been funding not just their household expenses and Marcus's business, but had also been making substantial contributions to what Marcus claimed were his independent retirement and investment accounts. The forensic analysis showed that Marcus's supposedly self-funded financial security was actually built entirely on Linda's systematic contributions and investment expertise. Ms. Wells presented a detailed breakdown showing that of the $800,000 in assets that Marcus claimed to have accumulated through his hard work and financial discipline, nearly $700,000 could be directly traced to Linda's income, investments, and inheritance. Marcus's actual financial contribution to their marital wealth amounted to less than 15% of their total assets, despite his claims of being the sole provider and financial decision-maker. Rebecca stood abruptly and walked out of the courtroom, unable to listen to any more evidence of how completely Marcus had deceived her about every aspect of his financial situation. The successful attorney she'd been dating was actually a man who had built his entire lifestyle and professional reputation on his wife's money, while systematically lying about her contributions to anyone who would listen. The courtroom observers, many of them other attorneys who had come to watch what they'd expected to be a routine divorce proceeding, sat in stunned silence as the scope of the deception became clear. Several attorneys were taking notes, undoubtedly recognizing that they were witnessing what would likely become a landmark case of perjury and financial misrepresentation in family court. Marcus's attorney Catherine Voss attempted damage control by arguing that the source of marital assets was less important than their legal classification, but Judge Blake cut her off with obvious irritation. The court is deeply concerned about the apparent perjury that occurred during your client's testimony yesterday, he stated, his voice carrying the weight of 30 years of judicial experience. The evidence presented today directly contradicts nearly every material claim made in Mr. Morrison's sworn testimony. David's presentation concluded with what he called the master financial timeline, a comprehensive chart that showed the flow of money throughout the Morrison marriage from Linda's various income sources into the accounts and investments that had funded their lifestyle and Marcus's professional success. The chart was devastating in its clarity, showing beyond any reasonable doubt that Linda had been not just the primary breadwinner, but the financial architect of everything Marcus claimed as his own achievement. Ms. Wells's final testimony focused on what she termed the opportunity cost of Linda's financial contributions, calculating that if Linda had invested her money independently rather than funding Marcus's lifestyle and business, she would have accumulated wealth worth approximately $1.2 million based on conservative market returns. Her sacrifice to support Marcus's career had cost her nearly $500,000 in personal financial growth. The forensic accountant also revealed that Linda had been paying the taxes on income that Marcus had claimed as his own, meaning that the IRS records would show Linda as the actual earner of money that Marcus had been representing as his independent income. This created potential tax liability issues for Marcus that went far beyond the divorce proceedings and into federal tax fraud territory. As Ms. Wells concluded her testimony, Marcus sat slumped in his chair like a man who had watched his entire life collapse in the space of a single afternoon. Every lie he'd told, every false claim he'd made about his financial independence and Linda's supposed dependence, had been systematically destroyed by documentation that he'd apparently forgotten existed or never realized his wife had carefully preserved. Linda remained as composed as she had throughout the entire proceedings, watching her husband face the consequences of 15 years of financial gaslighting and systematic deception about her role in their economic success. She had known this day would come eventually, had carefully documented and preserved every record that would be needed to prove the truth about their financial relationship. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the courthouse windows as David prepared to present his final piece of evidence for the day. He reached into what appeared to be his last folder and withdrew a single document that he placed on the overhead projector with careful ceremony. The document was a handwritten note, dated just 3 months earlier, in Marcus's own handwriting. The note was addressed to Linda and appeared to be a draft of a letter that Marcus had never sent. In his own words, the note acknowledged Linda's years of financial support and expressed gratitude for her willingness to fund his career and lifestyle while taking none of the credit for their shared financial success. The note mentioned specific amounts and investments, essentially serving as a written confession that contradicted every aspect of his courtroom testimony. "Mr. Morrison," David said quietly, "do you recognize this handwriting as your own?" Marcus stared at the document in horror, realizing that Linda had somehow obtained what he'd thought was a private draft that he'd written during a moment of guilt and then destroyed. The note was like a smoking gun that proved he'd been fully aware of Linda's contributions, even while planning to deny them in court. Marcus's admission that the handwriting was indeed his own marked the final collapse of his credibility and the complete vindication of Linda's position. The man who had walked into court confident that he could paint his wife as a dependent freeloader had been revealed as a systematic liar who had built his entire life on her financial foundation while denying her any credit for their shared success. As the court session ended, Judge Blake announced that he would need the evening to review the extensive documentation that had been presented, but his expression suggested that the outcome of the case was no longer in doubt. The evidence had painted such a clear picture of financial deception and marital fraud that the only remaining question was how severely Marcus would be sanctioned for his perjury and how completely his assets would be redistributed to reflect the true source of their marital wealth. Marcus left the courthouse that afternoon as a broken man whose lies had been exposed in the most public and humiliating way possible, while Linda walked out with quiet dignity, finally vindicated after years of being told that her substantial contributions were worthless and her financial expertise was non-existent. The truth had emerged with devastating clarity, and justice was finally within reach. Judge Harrison Blake entered the courtroom the following morning carrying a thick folder of notes, and wearing the expression of a man who had spent a sleepless night reviewing evidence that had fundamentally challenged his assumptions about human nature and professional ethics. 30 years on the bench had shown him countless examples of marital deception, but the systematic fraud and perjury he'd witnessed in the Morrison case represented something far beyond the typical divorce court lies that crossed his desk weekly. The gallery was fuller than it had been on the previous days, word having spread through the legal community that something extraordinary was happening in Courtroom 4B. Several prominent family law attorneys had cleared their morning schedules to witness what many suspected would become a landmark ruling on perjury and financial fraud in divorce proceedings. The atmosphere in the room carried the electric tension of people who understood they were about to witness either justice or its complete failure. Marcus Morrison sat at the plaintiff's table looking like a man who had aged a decade overnight. His expensive suit, which had projected such confidence just 2 days earlier, now seemed to hang on him like a costume from a play he no longer remembered how to perform. His hands trembled slightly as he arranged papers that no longer held any power to save him from the consequences of his systematic deception. Catherine Voss maintained her professional composure, but her usual courtroom confidence had been replaced by the careful neutrality of an attorney who recognized that her client's case had moved beyond salvageable into damage control territory. She had spent the evening researching precedents for perjury sanctions and attorney discipline procedures, knowing that Marcus's lies might result in professional consequences that would extend far beyond the divorce settlement. David Parks sat beside Linda with the quiet satisfaction of a chess master who had just delivered checkmate after a long and carefully planned campaign. His modest appearance, which had seemed so outmatched against Catherine's polished presentation just days earlier, now revealed itself to have been perfectly suited to his role as the patient architect of Marcus's complete destruction through his own documented lies. Linda remained as composed as she had throughout the entire proceedings, but there was something different in her posture that morning, a subtle straightening of her shoulders that suggested a woman who was finally about to step out from under the shadow of someone else's false narrative about her life and contributions. Judge Blake began his ruling with words that immediately silenced every whisper in the packed courtroom. In 30 years of presiding over family court proceedings, I have never encountered such systematic perjury and deliberate misrepresentation of material facts as I witnessed in this courtroom 2 days ago. The evidence presented yesterday has revealed a pattern of deception so comprehensive that it calls into question not only the veracity of the plaintiff's claims, but his fitness to continue practicing law in this jurisdiction. Marcus felt his stomach drop as the judge's words confirmed his worst fears about the professional consequences he would face beyond the divorce settlement. The legal community was small and tightly connected, and news of a perjury finding would spread quickly through every law firm, bar association meeting, and professional networking event in the state. The judge continued with a systematic dismantling of every major claim Marcus had made during his testimony. Mr. Morrison testified under oath that he had supported his wife entirely throughout their marriage, that she had contributed nothing to their financial success, and that she was incapable of understanding basic financial concepts. The evidence has shown each of these statements to be not merely false, but deliberately and maliciously false. Judge Blake's voice carried the weight of moral authority as he described the forensic evidence that had revealed Linda as the primary breadwinner, the financial architect of their wealth, and the funding source for Marcus's entire professional career. The defendant, Linda Morrison, emerges from this evidence not as the dependent freeloader her husband portrayed, but as a sophisticated financial professional who sacrificed her own economic opportunities to build the very success that her husband now claims as his sole achievement. The courtroom sat in absolute silence as Judge Blake delivered what amounted to a complete reversal of the initial case narrative. Based on the evidence presented, this court finds that approximately 85% of the marital assets can be directly attributed to Linda Morrison's financial contributions, investment expertise, and personal inheritance. The remaining 15% represents the only verifiable contribution made by Marcus Morrison to their shared wealth. Marcus closed his eyes as the judge announced the asset division that would strip away most of what he had claimed as his independent financial success. The law practice that he had built with Linda's inheritance money would be subject to significant financial redistribution. The investment portfolio that he had claimed as evidence of his financial acumen would be recognized for what it actually was: Linda's sophisticated wealth management disguised under his name. Furthermore, Judge Blake continued, this court finds that Mr. Morrison's testimony constituted willful perjury on multiple material points. I am referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for potential criminal prosecution and to the State Bar Association for immediate disciplinary review. An attorney who will lie under oath in his own divorce proceeding has demonstrated a fundamental unfitness for the practice of law. The professional death sentence that Judge Blake had just pronounced sent a visible shudder through the attorneys in the gallery. Perjury referrals were rare enough, but a judge publicly questioning an attorney's fitness to practice law represented a level of professional destruction that could end Marcus's career permanently. David Park stood to present what he called a final revelation that would complete the picture of Linda's actual role in their financial relationship. Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'd like to share that Mrs. Morrison has been quietly developing her own financial consulting business throughout these proceedings, serving clients who specifically seek her expertise in investment strategy and forensic financial analysis. Linda's business, Morrison Financial Solutions, had been operating discreetly for nearly a year while she prepared for the divorce proceedings. Her client list included several small businesses and individual investors who had benefited substantially from her strategic financial guidance. The consulting firm represented not just Linda's preparation for post-divorce life, but evidence of the financial expertise that Marcus had systematically denied and hidden throughout their marriage. The revelation that Linda had been building an independent business while Marcus was claiming she was unemployable served as a final nail in the coffin of his credibility. Judge Blake's expression showed something that might have been admiration for Linda's quiet strength and strategic thinking in the face of years of financial gaslighting and professional diminishment. The judge's final ruling was swift and decisive. This court awards Linda Morrison 75% of all marital assets, including 70% ownership in Morrison Legal Services, the family residence, and the entirety of the investment portfolio that she funded and managed. Marcus Morrison is ordered to pay spousal support in the amount of $8,000 per month for a period of 10 years, in addition to covering all of Linda's legal fees and court costs. The financial devastation was complete and immediate. Marcus would retain only his personal possessions and 25% of the business he had claimed as his sole creation. The comfortable lifestyle he had built on Linda's money while denying her credit would be replaced by years of financial struggle as he attempted to rebuild his career under the cloud of perjury charges and Bar Association investigation. Judge Blake's final words carried the weight of moral judgment that would follow Marcus far beyond the courtroom. Mr. Morrison, you entered this court seeking to deprive your wife of assets she had every right to claim. Through your own perjury and systematic deception, you have instead revealed the truth about who actually built the wealth you sought to protect. This is perhaps the most fitting example of poetic justice I have witnessed in my judicial career. Linda spoke publicly for the first time since the proceedings began, standing with quiet dignity to address the court. Your Honor, I want to thank you for recognizing the truth about our financial partnership. I hold no animosity toward my former husband, but I hope this case will encourage other women to document their contributions and never accept someone else's diminished version of their value. Her words carried the authority of someone who had endured years of systematic gaslighting about her own competence and contributions, but had maintained meticulous records that ultimately served as the foundation for her complete vindication. The quiet strength that had sustained her through Marcus's lies had been transformed into the backbone of her professional success. As the courtroom began to empty, Marcus remained seated, staring at his hands while contemplating the complete collapse of everything he had built his identity around. The successful attorney who had walked into court expecting easy victory was now facing potential criminal charges, professional discipline, and financial ruin that would take years to overcome. The other attorneys in the gallery filed out quietly, many of them undoubtedly reconsidering their own assumptions about dependent spouses and financial contributions in marriage. The Morrison case would become a cautionary tale told in law schools and Bar Association meetings for years to come, a reminder that systematic deception in family court could result in devastating consequences that extended far beyond the divorce settlement. Linda walked out of the courthouse that morning as a vindicated woman whose financial expertise and contributions had finally been recognized and protected by the legal system. Her quiet dignity throughout the proceedings had been transformed into the foundation for a new chapter of her life built on truth rather than deception, competence rather than dependence, and justice rather than manipulation. The swift and decisive nature of Judge Blake's ruling sent a clear message through the legal community that perjury and financial deception in divorce proceedings would be met with the full force of judicial consequences, both civil and criminal. Marcus Morrison's attempt to steal credit for his wife's achievements had instead resulted in the complete exposure of his own systematic dishonesty and professional unfitness. 6 months after Judge Blake's decisive ruling, Linda Morrison stood in the sunlit office of her expanding financial consulting firm, reviewing client portfolios that had grown substantially under her expert guidance. Morrison Financial Solutions occupied the entire third floor of a downtown building she had purchased with funds from her divorce settlement, a tangible symbol of the financial independence she had always possessed but had been systematically denied credit for during her marriage. Her client base had grown from the handful of small businesses she had served during the divorce proceedings to include several prominent local companies and wealthy individuals who specifically sought her expertise in investment strategy and financial planning. Word had spread quickly through professional networks about the consultant who had been quietly building wealth for years while her attorney husband falsely claimed credit for her achievements. The morning newspaper lay folded on her desk, open to the business section that featured a prominent article about her firm's success in helping local businesses navigate complex financial challenges during economic uncertainty. The reporter had been particularly interested in Linda's background story, though she had declined to discuss the details of her divorce case beyond confirming that her financial expertise had been undervalued in her previous personal situation. Linda's assistant knocked and entered with the day's appointment schedule, which included meetings with 3 potential new clients who had been referred by existing customers satisfied with her strategic financial guidance. Her reputation for conservative but effective investment strategies had attracted clients who valued steady growth over flashy returns, exactly the approach that had quietly built substantial wealth during her marriage while Marcus took public credit for their financial success. The view from her office window overlooked the courthouse where her vindication had taken place just months earlier. She could see the building where Judge Blake had delivered the ruling that had finally recognized her true contributions and protected her rightful assets from someone who had tried to steal credit for achievements that were never his own. Her phone buzzed with a text from her lawyer David Park, who had become both a trusted advisor and friend during the months since the trial. The message informed her that Marcus's appeal of the divorce settlement had been denied by the appellate court, which had found Judge Blake's ruling to be thoroughly supported by evidence and appropriate given the scope of perjury that had been documented during the proceedings. Marcus Morrison's legal troubles had continued to multiply in the months since the divorce was finalized. The State Bar Association had suspended his law license pending completion of their disciplinary investigation, and the district attorney's office had formally charged him with multiple counts of perjury related to his false testimony. His law practice had collapsed as clients fled to avoid association with an attorney facing criminal charges and professional discipline. The financial obligations imposed by Judge Blake's ruling had forced Marcus to liquidate most of his remaining assets to meet the spousal support payments and legal fee reimbursements he owed Linda. His comfortable lifestyle, built entirely on money Linda had earned and invested, had been replaced by a modest apartment and the daily struggle of trying to rebuild a career under the shadow of criminal prosecution and professional disgrace. Rebecca Chun had disappeared from Marcus's life within weeks of the trial, having realized that the successful attorney she thought she was dating was actually a financially ruined man whose entire persona had been built on systematic lies about his wife's contributions. She had blocked his phone number and moved on to pursue relationships with men whose success stories were more verifiable and less dependent on deceiving their previous partners. Linda's transformation from the quiet, dismissed wife who had sat silently through Marcus's lies to the confident business owner who now commanded respect from sophisticated clients, had been remarkable to witness. Several of her former acquaintances had reached out to apologize for accepting Marcus's characterization of her as financially incompetent, admitting they should have recognized the intelligence and capability that had been obvious to anyone paying attention. The local business community had embraced Linda's success story as an example of how talent and expertise could emerge from situations where they had been systematically suppressed. She had been invited to speak at women's business organizations and financial planning seminars, sharing her experience of building wealth and maintaining financial independence even within a relationship designed to minimize her contributions. Her new home, purchased with funds from her rightfully recovered assets, reflected her personal taste rather than Marcus's preferences for the first time in 15 years. The contemporary design and open layout created space for the life she was building independently, free from the constant undermining and financial control that had characterized her marriage. Linda had used part of her settlement to establish a small scholarship fund for women pursuing careers in financial planning and business consulting, particularly those who were returning to the workforce after periods of financial dependence. The scholarship honored her grandmother, whose inheritance had unknowingly funded Marcus's law career, while he denied Linda any credit for the sacrifice she had made on his behalf. As you follow stories like Linda's, I'm curious about your own experiences with financial partnerships and fairness. Have you ever witnessed situations where someone's contributions were overlooked or minimized by those who benefited from their work? Share your thoughts in the comments below, whether it's about workplace dynamics, family businesses, or relationship partnerships where credit wasn't given where it was due. The professional network Linda had built through her consulting firm had become a source of referrals and collaborative opportunities that continued to expand her influence in the local business community. Her reputation for ethical business practices and financial expertise had attracted clients who specifically valued working with someone whose integrity had been tested and proven in the most challenging circumstances imaginable. Marcus's attempts to rebuild his legal career had been hampered not only by his criminal charges and bar suspension, but by the widespread knowledge of his systematic dishonesty that had been exposed during the divorce proceedings. The legal community was small and closely connected, and trust once broken through documented perjury was nearly impossible to restore among professionals whose livelihoods depended on credibility. Linda's quiet satisfaction came not from Marcus's downfall, which she viewed as the natural consequence of his own choices, but from the validation of her financial expertise and the recognition of contributions that had been denied for so long. The systematic gaslighting about her competence had been replaced by daily confirmation from successful clients who valued her strategic thinking and investment guidance. The final irony of their situation was that Marcus's financial struggles were forcing him to learn the money management skills he had always claimed Linda lacked, while Linda's business success was proving the financial sophistication he had spent years denying she possessed. The truth about their respective capabilities had emerged through consequences that reflected their actual character and competence rather than the false narrative Marcus had constructed. As Linda prepared for her afternoon client meetings, she reflected on how the truth about financial partnerships had a way of revealing itself eventually, regardless of how systematically someone tried to suppress or misrepresent it. Her story had become a reminder that real financial expertise could not be permanently hidden, and that justice, though sometimes delayed, had a way of recognizing genuine contributions even when they had been deliberately obscured. The success of Morrison Financial Solutions represented more than just Linda's personal vindication. It had become a symbol of what was possible when financial expertise was finally allowed to operate freely rather than being suppressed by someone whose own success had been built on denying credit where it was truly due. Her clients benefited from working with someone whose abilities had been tested under the most challenging circumstances and had emerged stronger and more confident than ever before.